All right, we're good.
Okay, so it's 7:01 p.m. and I'm going to call this meeting to order. Len, can you please call the roll?
Sure. Claire Touton,
Here.
Dave Olson,
Here.
Jill Grant. Hi, Jill, you're not mute. Can you hear me? I can't hear you, Jill. I can't hear. Oh, okay. Greg Diegas,
Here.
Dan Haggerty,
Here.
Michelle Weil,
Here.
myself here. I'll count Jill as here. She's acknowledged it with text. We're all present.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is a special meeting of the MCC, and the purpose of this is to review the Brown Act and Rosenberg's Rules of Order. To keep this meeting short, I streamlined the agenda, but the first item on the agenda is public comments and announcements. We haven't received any correspondence. If anyone in the public would like to speak during this section, could you please raise your hand now?
Can I suggest that you explain to possible new members how to raise their hand, please?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so in order to raise your hand, you need to click on the participants list, and then there are several options, the first of which is a blue raise hand button, and that's how you would raise your hand. I believe if you're on the phone, there is a way to do that too.
Right.
Dave?
*9.
*9. Great, thank you. Okay, I don't see any raised hands, so we're going to move on to the regular agenda. The first item is the Ralph M. Brown Act, and we have Timothy Fox from the County Counsel's Office here, and he's going to be giving a presentation. So I'll hand it over to you, Tim.
Thank you. All right, I'm sharing my screen now. I hope you can see it.
We can, thank you.
Thank you for having me. My name is Tim Fox. I'm a deputy in the County Counsel's Office, and our office provides legal support and advice to county agencies, including the MCC. I've been a lawyer in the County Counsel's Office for a little over 15 years now, and I have, over the course of years, had many interactions with the Brown Act. I hope I'll be able to answer all of your questions, if not from experience, from the text of the statute, which is even better still. Okay, so let's get started. So this is part of a larger training in ethics for local government officials, of which you are now one. I know some of you have been involved in county government in some form or another for a number of years, and the Brown Act might be like second nature to you. I promise you, though, that I do have something new to teach you. It may be on the last slide or two, but there is late breaking news, some legislation that was just signed in September that I think profoundly impacts the way that local government officials should behave, particularly online. So even if this is old hat to you, I hope you'll hang in there and learn something toward the end. If you're new to public service in California, your experience of the Brown Act as a layperson, as a constituent, is about to change. The Brown Act is a matter of significant attention and concern. It tends to be bandied about by members of the public whenever they want to communicate some kind of distress about a government decision. It is one of the few laws that non-lawyers tend to know by name. And as a result, because people have a general idea that it is a law that relates to government corruption, it gets thrown out there whenever somebody disagrees with a government decision, even if it's not really technically applicable. So we see it raised in public discourse, in newspapers, in editorials, but you have to actually care about what it really says, because it does control your behavior to a degree, more so than it ever did before you joined public service as an official on the MCC. So why do we talk about government transparency as a general matter? The first is that it adds an element of trustworthiness to our process because the public can trust a process that it can observe. Things that happen behind closed doors are often given the worst of all possible motives and intentions. Things that happen out in the open are somewhat harder to characterize that way. So the public's better able to lean in on whatever decision is made if that decision is made in a public setting. In addition, there's a component of respect to our transparency laws because the Brown Act both requires that public officials behave in a certain way, but it also gives the public some rights to participate in the process. And because of the rights that they're conferred by the Brown Act, even if they don't actually win the day, even if the decision doesn't go their way, generally speaking, we find that if the process has been followed, there is somewhat more trust in the outcome because people feel respected. They feel that they got their chance to say their piece, even if they couldn't get others to agree with them. So the heart of government transparency laws, which includes the Brown Act, it also includes the Public Records Act, is that the conduct of the public's business is the public's business, that we're not just in a game of outcomes where we announce the decisions that were made. We actually, like math teachers have been asking us to do for many years, we show our work. We display our thought process, as ugly as it might be, as awkward as it might be. We do our thinking out loud in the public. And that allows the public to see how we got from A to B. And they have the right to see that. They have the right not just to be told what their government has decided, but to see how the sausage was made. And that's what the Brown Act generally requires, is that when we have these discussions, they occur in a public setting, even if it would be more streamlined and elegant for there to be discussions behind closed doors first. This is not about streamlined and elegant. This is about ugly and messy and honest. And that's what the Brown Act is designed to promote. So you'll notice that when members of the public feel that the Brown Act has been violated, the very first thing they talk about is the consequences of that. They want to talk about people going to jail for violating the Brown Act. It generally doesn't tend to happen. In fact, since this was enacted into law in the early 1960s, not a single public official in California has served a day in prison for violating the Brown Act. Some have come very close, but none have actually done so. The consequences of violating the Brown Act are mostly optical. They mostly have to do with the fact that now we're having a discussion about our process rather than a discussion about the merits of the policy. So I'm giving you some examples of headlines that have related to the Brown Act. Generally, that's as far as it goes, though. Not always, and I can't promise that it will always be so. But for the most part, county agencies don't like being accused of violating the Brown Act. They have a strong incentive to do things properly because they don't want the distraction of having an argument about what the Brown Act required or didn't require. And so following the recommendations and advice of staff and our office and implementing procedures that are predictable and invariant are a wise approach, because if you always do things the right way, you won't depart from those right ways in individual circumstances and create a problem where someone's accusing you of something, even if there's a good defense for what you did. So why do we call it the Ralph M. Brown Act? Well, it's because there was a guy named Ralph M. Brown. He was a member of the Assembly and then was later appointed to the Court of Appeal, became a judge. And he, with the cooperation of the League of Cities, enacted California's first open meeting law. And California actually innovated a lot of stuff about these open meeting laws in the late 1950s, early 1960s. It was before my time, so I don't know how business was conducted before there was a Brown Act, but I'm told there are stories about public agencies that would literally meet behind closed doors, presumably in smoke-filled rooms, because at that time all rooms were smoke-filled. And they would decide what they were going to decide. They would have a pre-meeting, and then they would go out and meet the public and announce to the public basically how it was going to be. So it was pretty common for California public agencies to meet behind closed doors in a pre-meeting and then go out and have a meeting for show, where they explained to the public why what they had already basically decided was a good idea. And the League of Cities and a small number of reformers got the ear of Ralph Brown and had the law drafted. It originally was much shorter and simpler to comply with. It's grown in size and complexity over the course of years. But the basic meat of it was that if you're going to have a public meeting, you have to have it in public. And that's how it started. So things that have happened since then are that the voters of California decided to enshrine both this law and the California Public Records Act into the state constitution in a ballot proposition in 2004. That was Proposition 59. It didn't really change much by way of substance in the Brown Act or the Public Records Act. It merely said that the people wanted this to be in their constitution. So it did elevate it to a matter of constitutional right in the state of California. In addition, we know that because of its constitutional nature, when a court is asked to construe the public's rights versus the government's rights, which still remain but are narrow, to conduct some business in private, that the courts will essentially construe the public's rights very broadly and the government's rights fairly narrowly. So we have to anticipate that. And anytime the legislature adopts new legislation that creates an exception to public access, it needs to do so with a heightened level of reasoning to support that decision. And for the most part, we've seen that even when good ideas of reforming the Brown Act come forward, they do run into this principle that it is now a matter of constitutional dimension. So the legislative intent of the Brown Act is that the people don't yield their sovereignty to the agencies that serve them. And when they delegate authority, they don't give public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. They insist on remaining informed so that they can retain control over the instruments they have created. The purpose behind this law is that public business be done in public meetings. And that sounds simple, but maybe it's a bit deceptive because there are complications. In general, though, the answer to every Brown Act question is, can we do this in a public meeting? And the answer is yes. There may be rights that you have to choose to do it in a different way, but generally speaking, when you hold a meeting, it is a public meeting. That's the default position that you should get comfortable with, the idea that as a public official, you are beholden to the public and they get to see how you behave, how you talk, how you think in these public meetings. So I'm going to break down the topics for tonight into to whom does it apply, what is a meeting, which as I said is potentially a bit more complicated than you might think. What are the agenda requirements? What rights do the public have? What are closed sessions and when are they allowed? And what are the consequences for violating the Brown Act? I'll get to that last because even though it often is a matter of foremost interest, particularly for a new public official in California, they want to talk about that first. It actually makes much more sense to talk about it later because there are so many ways to stay compliant and not worry about violations. To whom does the Brown Act apply? Well, I could easily answer the question by saying it applies to you. But in general, it applies to all legislative bodies of local governments of the state of California. That includes city councils, it includes the Board of Supervisors, it includes planning commissions, a number of other types of agencies that make and administer laws. So it means the governing body of a local agency, like the Board of Supervisors in the case of the unincorporated areas of the county. But it also includes committees that are created by formal action of that governing board. So therefore, it applies to you. In other words, because the Board of Supervisors has to comply with the Brown Act, when it creates a subsidiary agency like the MCC, the board's own requirement to comply with the Brown Act flows down to you. You are complying with the Board of Supervisors' obligations to comply with the Brown Act, because obviously it would be a huge loophole if it were possible for a Brown Act body, as we call them, a legislative body that was obligated to meet in public, if it could simply create committees that didn't have to, because then there'd be a strong incentive to do that on an ongoing basis, and more public functions would occur behind closed doors again. It includes committees that you create too, though. So it flows down and keeps flowing down unless there's a reason for it not to. And we'll talk about the rare circumstances where that might be the case. It includes all standing committees that you might create by some official action. If the MCC decides that it wants to have a committee on such and such, that committee must comply with the Brown Act unless one of the exceptions applies. It includes advisory subcommittees, even those that don't have a jurisdiction to go and do anything more than come back and make a recommendation, okay? So in general, all the subsidiary groups of you that you might choose to create to make sure the conversation keeps happening, to promote the effective conduct of the public's business, all the subcommittees that you create, by default, the Brown Act applies to them. But there is one exception, and I'll turn to that in a moment. The Brown Act does not apply to individual decision makers. It doesn't apply to staff meetings. It doesn't apply to individual elected officials that meet with other elected officials not on the same body. The assessor doesn't need to comply with the Brown Act. The clerk recorder, the controller, basically any individual decision maker in government doesn't need to comply with the Brown Act and can consult with whomever he or she likes without having to hold a public meeting to do so, unless there's some other law other than the Brown Act that would require them to hold public meetings. So a huge number of government meetings are happening behind closed doors every day. Some of them are behind closed doors because nobody cares and doesn't want to attend the meeting anyway. Others are behind closed doors because there is no law that requires them to be open to the public. But the Brown Act says that when you're a legislative body or a committee created by a legislative body, the Brown Act does apply to you and you do need to meet in public. So who is not subject to the Brown Act? Well, the people I just talked about a moment ago, individual decision makers, even if they meet in a group. Deliberative bodies, the ones that meet together to come up with a collective decision, tend to be much more likely to fall into the category of must comply with the Brown Act. But I told you that one kind of subcommittee is an exception to this rule, that if you create a subcommittee, the Brown Act applies, but one kind of subcommittee, it doesn't apply. And I'm here to tell you what that one kind of subcommittee is. Ad hoc advisory subcommittees made up solely of governing board members and constituting less than a quorum are not subject to the Brown Act. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're the governing body of the MCC, by the way. So this means that this rule does apply to you. If you create an ad hoc advisory subcommittee made up solely of your members and constituting less than a quorum of you, then you don't need to meet in public. You can meet at Starbucks, you can meet in somebody's living room. Again, maybe not in times of COVID, but you can have Zoom meetings of less than a quorum of you if you're following this rule. What is an ad hoc advisory subcommittee? It's a subcommittee that's created for a limited time, for a limited subject matter jurisdiction, and that does not answer to the governing board itself, does not answer to the MCC itself about when and where it meets. So essentially, it's like a study group. If there were particular interest by certain members of the MCC in a particularly important issue that required people to study the issue and come up with actionable information, actionable items, and the MCC itself was having trouble struggling in its meeting to come up with a proposal that enough people would support, you could create an ad hoc advisory subcommittee to report back to you within 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, limited term, on just the item that they've been asked to study and to make a recommendation to you. And you can appoint up to 3 of you to be on that ad hoc advisory subcommittee. Can't be 4, because then it's not less than a quorum, but it can be 3 of you to be on the ad hoc advisory subcommittee. It can't be a standing committee, though. It can't be, we're the MCC subcommittee on land use, and we're going to meet privately. We're going to meet on Zoom. We're going to meet at a Starbucks. We're going to exclude the public from our discussions. You can create, for a limited term, a small group of you to study a particular issue, a particular project, a particular community concern, and bring back, without having any delegated authority to make decisions, merely to bring back a recommendation where the subcommittee says, we've looked at this issue, we considered 4 alternatives, one of them is superior, and we recommend that the whole body take this action. That would be perfectly legal. That would be an ad hoc advisory subcommittee. Who else is not subject to the Brown Act? Committees that are not created by any kind of formal action of the legislative body at all. So if 3 of you decided that you were going to meet and there were no, and meet on a regular basis even, and there were never any blessing on the part of the MCC for you to be the committee that does this, then you weren't created by formal action of the MCC, and the Board of Supervisors requirement to comply with the Brown Act does not flow through the MCC to the group of you that just informally decided to appoint yourselves to this committee. But if you want to go about calling yourself as a committee of the MCC, then it's going to require some kind of formal action. And if you think about it, and I have thought about it for 15 years, if you think about it, this really doesn't create anything new. This is just the general rule. Remember that the Brown Act applies to the MCC and its subcommittees. If you're not a subcommittee of the MCC, the Brown Act doesn't apply to you. So this is not really an exception to the rule. This is the rule doesn't apply to gatherings of less than a majority of the MCC that weren't at the behest of the MCC at all. So eventually it just becomes a comfortable part of, if this is just something that happens naturally, that 3 of us meet somewhere to talk about this issue, the Brown Act doesn't apply because there was never any formal convocation of you to be anything in particular in a room together. So now we're going to turn to the question of what is a meeting, because this is a little bit counterintuitive. A meeting is obviously the meetings of the MCC, the ones that are scheduled on the 2nd and 4th Wednesday of every month, I think it is. You have a meeting schedule, and when you show up to those meetings, you are the MCC. That is an MCC meeting. But anytime a majority of you happen to be in the same place at the same time, and you are hearing, discussing, or deliberating on matters within your jurisdiction, which I can tell you is very broad, your jurisdiction is extremely broad, then you are a meeting. So if 4 of you are in a room together and you are hearing, discussing, or deliberating any matters relating essentially to quality of life of co-siders in the Midcoast, you're conducting a meeting if you are gathered together. Okay, so this means that a majority of you can't consult among yourselves outside of an official agency convened meeting about matters within your jurisdiction. And that's extremely broad. Don't worry, I'm about to tell you there are a couple of exceptions, because you may have already realized, oh my goodness, we have been in a room together to hear, discuss, and deliberate, and it wasn't a formal agendized meeting. But generally speaking, anytime 4 or more of you are gathered in the same place at the same time to talk about something relating to quality of life for people in the Midcoast, you should be posting an agenda. And you can post an agenda either 72 hours in advance for a regular meeting, or 24 hours in advance of a special meeting. But you should be thinking in terms of, I want to get together with the MCC, therefore I must post an agenda. That should be the reflex that you develop, that anytime 4 of you are gathered together, your thought is there an agenda posted? Because if there is, you have free range of motion to discuss amongst yourselves, because you gave the public advance warning that this is going to happen. If you didn't post an agenda, you need to behave somewhat differently. So illegal meetings are those where a majority of members develop a concurrence as to action on business, that is, matters within your subject matter jurisdiction, through either serial meetings, intermediaries, communication, or other means. I'm going to loop back into that definition of a meeting because there are some exceptions, but we're going to talk about what it means for intermediaries or other kinds of communication to implicate a majority of board members, because that is probably the biggest source of questions that we get from county agencies. Email, social media, phone calls, those are the questions that bedevil local agencies in terms of Brown Act compliance. Let's talk about the first example of an illegal meeting. It's called a serial meeting, and it's kind of a classic example of how you can circumvent the rule that I've just described. So I said that if 4 of you are gathered together in the same place at the same time to hear, discuss, or deliberate matters within your jurisdiction, you're holding a meeting. Well, now I'm going to tell you that even if you're not in the same place, and even if you're not at the same time, you can still violate this rule by having something called a serial meeting. This is where one member talks to another member, and then that member talks to another member, and then that member talks to another member in a chain communication that implicates a majority of you. That's 4. 4 is a majority of you. I'll be hammering on that notion all night. This is a violation of the Brown Act because it allows people to develop a collective concurrence as to action without ever having a meeting where they're all in the same place at the same time and creating, alerting the public to the fact that the meeting is taking place. So it's kind of easy in the days of email to understand that if somebody drafts an email and sends it to one other member, and then that member forwards it to another member, and that gets forwarded to another member, that essentially you're engaged in a communication amongst 4 people. It wasn't intended by the first person to send the email, but it was definitely intended by the last one to forward it, right? So if a person sends a communication that finally brings about implicating 4 members of the MCC, it has become a serial meeting and it is potentially a violation of the Brown Act. Here's another example. This is called a hub meeting for reasons I hope are obvious. This is where a majority of members are implicated in a communication with a single member. Maybe a little bit more obvious than a serial meeting, but this is where one person proceeds to lobby 3 other members of the MCC on a matter within their jurisdiction outside of the public meeting. And this is illegal as well. It is the use of communication to hear, discuss, or deliberate amongst a majority. And examples of this might be obvious. This could be one person passionate about an issue facing the MCC, concerned that he or she is not being understood in the public meetings, calling those members privately and saying, I really need you to vote this way because it will be tragic if you don't for the following reasons. Well, if you call 3 other members of the MCC and lobby them in that way, you have violated the Brown Act. Because the public deserves to see you do that. They want to hear what you have to say to your fellow members when you're talking amongst a majority of you. So hub meetings are illegal because they are essentially a huge circumvention of the rule that when a majority of you are hearing, discussing, or deliberating on a matter within your jurisdiction and developing a collective concurrence, whether successfully or not, the public is invited to that conversation, gets to see and hear what is being said, and gets to comment on it. Okay, are you seeing all a full screen of bullet points? This is where I started to have problems with my animations, so I can't tell whether or not you can see everything all at once or not.
We're seeing as far as long as majority does not discuss council business.
Okay, great. Well, that means that my animation wasn't working, so we'll just we'll adjust. Okay, so what is not a meeting? What's not a meeting is any gathering or communication that implicates less than a majority. And on a 7-member board, as you might guess, the magic number is 3. It's U plus 2. On a 5-member board, like the Board of Supervisors, it's U plus 1. On the school boards, most of the school boards in the Bay Area, it's U plus 1. But for the MCC with a 7-member board, you have a little bit more flexibility. You can have a conversation with 2 other members of the MCC to create a group of 3 that have all talked about a thing offline outside of the public setting. And none of those 3 can then add a 4th to the conversation. So you need to know who you've been talking to, and you need to know who it is that you've been talking to has been talking to. Because if it turns out that you've been talking to 2 other people, and one of those other people has also been talking to 2 other people, not in the same people, then you've had essentially a hub plus a chain. And you have not personally violated the Brown Act, but the person that communicated with a majority has. And they may not feel that it was wrong. They may not realize it was wrong, but it does violate the Brown Act for you to have a meeting of a majority, even if it's occurring at different times spread out. What is also not a meeting? Any individual contacts between you and any other person not on the MCC. So this is a question we get a lot, but can a council member work directly with members of the public about a specific issue? And the answer is absolutely. That is expressly provided by the Brown Act, that members of the public can't violate the Brown Act, only you can. So that member of the public can even talk to all 7 of you. They can have a chain communication all day long. They can have a hub communication all day long. You can't. You have fewer First Amendment rights to lobby your fellow government officials than people who don't hold any elective or appointive office. The day you took the oath of office, you gave up a little bit of your First Amendment right to petition your government. You have to petition your fellow members of the MCC in public at public meetings. You can't do it privately the way that individual members of the public can. But I included this caveat. That rule changes if the MCC goes so far as to say, yeah, there's a passionate member of our group that wants to talk about this issue further. And there are members of the public that are equally passionate. They're here in the audience and they have a lot of great ideas. Let's appoint them all to a committee. Well, once you've done that, they've got to start posting an agenda. Because remember that an ad hoc advisory subcommittee consists of solely less than a majority of the membership of the MCC. So if you appoint one MCC member and other members of the public to a study, a study session or a committee, that committee now needs to meet in public because other members of the public have a right to see what they're hearing, discussing, and deliberating. And then finally, it's not a meeting if a majority of you are at either a conference open to the public, social or ceremonial occasions, or another public meeting on a topic of local community concern. So all 7 of you can go to the Board of Supervisors meeting. And even though all 7 of you are in a room and you are there to hear, if not discuss and deliberate, a matter within your jurisdiction, you are not violating the Brown Act because you are merely an attendee of another public meeting on a matter of local community concern. You can also go to the Half Moon Bay City Council. You can go to the Coastal Commission. You can go to, and this is a majority of you, by the way. This is a rule that applies to a majority of you. Going to other public meetings to hear about matters of concern. However, while you are there at that meeting, whether it's at a conference or at a Board of Supervisors meeting or anywhere, social ceremonial occasion, you may not confer amongst yourselves about matters of MCC business. So if, for example, the Half Moon Bay Chamber of Commerce is hosting a luncheon at some point in the future, perhaps, and you all get a table together and you're sitting together at a table as the MCC table, you can't talk about MCC stuff. The one thing you all have in common, you're not allowed to talk about. You can talk about your kids. You can talk about the weather. But if everybody sees you sitting together at a table, they're going to assume that you're talking about the one thing they know you all have in common. And this is where we get some accusations of, at so-and-so's Christmas party, I saw 3 members of the city council and they were all talking in a corner and obviously they were violating the Brown Act. Well, maybe they weren't, maybe they were, but in general, you are not allowed to discuss council business, even if it is legal for you to be in the room as part of the public presentation to hear, discuss, and deliberate the matters that are the subject of that meeting. So I was given the big reveal of the answer. I was supposed to fly in on an animation, but that's not working for me now. I was given the question, well, what about if a presentation is given to the MCC and then afterwards 3 members spontaneously connect over email to discuss the presentation. They engage with other members of the public who add additional information. Maybe it's in support of what was learned. Maybe it's disputing what was learned in the presentation. And now those 3 members want to bring the item back for further discussion by the whole group and ask that it be agendized again for further discussion. Has a Brown Act violation occurred? Well, if you see the screen, you know the answer. The answer is no. This is not a violation of the Brown Act for reasons I've already discussed. This is not a committee that was created by official action of the board. If it were, there would be a way to establish that it was an ad hoc advisory subcommittee. Ad hoc advisory subcommittees can meet with members of the public. They just can't have members of the public be members of the ad hoc committee. But everything that's been done is actually very naturally part of the way that public business is conducted. Officials get together, they talk, they learn, they go and confer with constituents and stakeholders, and then they come back and they say what they want to do. So this is actually entirely within the bounds of the Brown Act to do it this way. And that includes saying at the meeting, the subsequent meeting, I met with you know, council member so-and-so and another council member, and we had a great meeting and we talked about all this. You can talk about all this stuff. You don't have to hide anything. You can say, we had a very extensive discussion of the issue and we came up with this idea. And the three of us endorse it, you can even say. Because remember, the Brown Act applies to the MCC, a majority of the MCC, or an official committee created by the MCC. And three members spontaneously getting together to talk about an issue of concern falls into none of those categories. Okay, a question about the use of email, which I know is particularly important for the municipal advisory committees, because you don't always have extensive staff support the way that you know, the Board of Supervisors or the City Council has, where they can just tell people to go do work between meetings. So it falls on you in a lot of cases to do the follow-up. Let's give some examples of good use of email that doesn't violate the Brown Act. Emailing the chair or staff to say that you're available for a meeting, or even ask a question about an agenda item, perfectly fine. Again, you're burning one of your U+2 if you communicate with the chair to say, I've got a question, or simply to say that you're available for a meeting. We've opined that scheduling a meeting or establishing an agenda is not a communication in violation of the Brown Act. Stating that you're available to schedule a special meeting, even if you send it to all members of the board, you could send a reply all saying, I'm not available on Thursday. That's not a violation of the Brown Act. Inviting a group of three of you, U+2, to work on a specific issue, doing that by email, perfectly legal, perfectly appropriate. Asking your board buddy, one or two other members of the MCC that you have a good rapport with, to brief you on the background relating to an issue or the history of previous times the council has considered things. Emailing one or two people to get that background, totally appropriate. Emailing all of them, we'll get to that a little further down. Emailing everybody and saying, I need this explained to me, that has to happen in public. If you're asking more than a majority, if you're asking a majority, you need to ask that question in public, but you can ask a board buddy without violating the rule. So in other words, let's switch to the bad portion, bad use of email. Inviting all the members of the MCC to work with you on a specific issue is something that should happen in public, not by sending an email to everybody on the MCC. Asking for a collective briefing on an issue, even if it's just by way of background, also something that shouldn't be sent to everybody, should be sent to only less than a majority. And then gathering feedback from all members in order to formulate a response or action, say to a letter that you've received or a social media post, just trying to like get everybody on the same page about how to respond. That's exactly what the Brown Act forbids. Getting everybody on the same page is something that happens in a public meeting, not something that happens over email. This is true even if a member of the MCC sends an email to everybody saying, I want your feedback on how we should respond. Please reply only to me. Well, if 6 members of the MCC all email the same person with their suggested feedback, you've just created a hub meeting. You're the center of the hub. So all the people sending the email to the one person who formulates the response and synthesizes the response, that's a violation of the Brown Act. So now let's talk about the group writing problem, which I know is one that the MCC is currently facing. If the council wishes to publish a document of any kind, it creates some unique Brown Act problems because, you know, anything written by committee is written by committee. So if 3 members take the initiative to draft a document that's going to come from the MCC, and it's shared with all members and vetted, please give me your feedback, please comment, please look at this, tell me whether I've gotten it wrong. If all those edits are incorporated into the final document and that goes out, even if it goes out after a public meeting to daylight the final document, the deliberation happened behind closed doors. It may not have been, you know, super serious. It may not have been much in the way of consequence, but in general, a group writing project is by definition developing a concurrence as to the document. So it really should happen in a public meeting. So you might want to think about ways, if you're going to do published materials, to either give a single person responsibility for editing the whole thing, or just to have authors and attribute authorship to individuals and not the MCC, so that you don't have to necessarily push every document through Google Docs in order to get a synthesized, written by committee, everybody agrees that this is what goes out kind of thing. Because there really isn't a very elegant way for the MCC to draft a document as a group, except if you do it the way Thomas Jefferson did with the Declaration of Independence. Here, you go write this, bring it back. Oh, that looks perfect. I'll sign it. That would be fine if the signing happens in a public meeting, right? So if you delegate to one person, that one person writes the whole thing, and then it gets brought back to a public meeting and everybody says, great job, Tom. We're signing our name on the bottom. That would be okay. But the feedback is the problem, not the approval. Okay, I promise you the other topics are less extensive and somewhat simpler for you. What are the agenda requirements? I promise you that was the third question we would answer in the presentation. The agenda requirements relates to the right of the public to know whether something's going to be discussed at a meeting. For regular meetings, you're supposed to post an agenda 72 hours in advance, and posting in today's day and age means both physically placing it at the meeting location and posting it to the website of the agency, which is better in days of Zoom meetings. Special meetings are those that are called off schedule, not the second and fourth Wednesday of every month, but on an off schedule. If a meeting is set by action of the board outside of that standard board calendar, it becomes a special meeting, and you can post an agenda 24 hours in advance. All the same rules about where you do it apply. There are limited exceptions for when you can take action on any matter of business, no matter how important, that's not listed on the agenda. I'll have briefly discussed that, although it's a rare circumstance. Every agenda has to contain a brief description of every item to be discussed, and there is such a thing as too much description and such a thing as too little. So you shouldn't have long paragraphs that describe what the issue is, but you also should have more than a couple of words in the ordinary case. Because the public, it's basically comes down to fair notice to the public about whether or not they should attend. If they care about the issue, should they show up to the meeting? They need to know that, and the agenda is sometimes the only hint that they have. If there is a closed session that's planned, the closed session items must be listed, and there's safe harbor language that's provided by the statute. If you use the safe harbor language, you're generally free from accusations of not being adequately specific. And every agenda must include time for public comment, and every agency does this somewhat differently. Sometimes public comment's done at the beginning of the meeting, and we ask the public to talk about both matters that are of general interest to the public, and if they have any comments on the agenda items, they can say what they want to say then. Most agencies adopt a hybrid model where there's general public comment that's about items not on the agenda, and then as each agenda item is called, the public is invited to talk then after hearing the presentation or getting the same information the board did. So, generally public comment corresponds to an action, and you have to let the public talk. We really strongly advise that you let the public comment take place before you deliberate, and certainly before you make a decision. So there can be a thing where the presentation is given, and now the chair throws it to the members of the body for any questions, and the questions kind of gradually morph into people stating their interests, people stating their views, deliberation. And then when it's clear how everybody's going to vote, because they've kind of been spitballing their ideas about the topic, then they're like, oh, we should probably ask the public if they have anything to say. You should be more in the habit of presentation is given, the board or the council limits itself to questions it has for the speaker to make sure that everybody understands the issues, then invite the public, then deliberate. And we do recommend that you adopt a formal process for opening and closing a public hearing so that you don't wind up getting dragged into people getting up multiple times or waiting, sandbagging their comments until the last minute. So different agencies can choose how best to represent their constituents in the way that they see fit. But in general, we say, accept public comment before you start to deliberate. because you're supposed to deliberate based on what you heard, both from the presentation and the public comment, and not have made up your mind in advance. Okay, so I told you that there's a limitation on the ability to discuss things that aren't on the agenda. Generally, there is a provision for emergency meetings. It's super rare to actually meet the statutory definition of an emergency. We have actually done so now in COVID times, but before this happened, I can't think of very many public agencies that met the definition of a literal emergency that allowed them to add something to the agenda after it was posted. But there's another avenue, which is when by a 2/3 vote, you determine that there's a need to take immediate action and some matter came to light to the agency's attention after the agenda was posted. But you have to be really honest about whether or not it was simply that we forgot to put it on the agenda. That's not a thing coming to light after the agenda was posted. It's like literally you got an item of correspondence within the 72 hours after the regular meeting agenda was posted. That would work. We didn't get the letter until after the agenda was posted. If you can get 2/3 of you to vote to add it to the agenda, that would be legal to do. So in general, the rights of the public, the fourth topic I promised, are the right to be notified of items by a brief description on the agenda, so it's clear whether they should attend. The right to attend without having to identify themselves. It's definitely okay to ask them who they are, but if they refuse to tell you, you can't block them from the room or exclude them from the Zoom meeting. You can use speaker cards, and if people fill them out, that's great. It's a great tool to use when you're having an in-person meeting. You can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, perfectly legal to do that. But if a person refuses to identify themselves, I just recommend that you let it happen. They have the right to record the meeting, so long as the recording doesn't occur in any disruptive manner. So they can't set up a camera right in the face of the chair of the council to distract him or her. That wouldn't be okay. But if they put up a camera in the back of the room, it's perfectly legal for them to do so. They have the right to speak before or during consideration of an item. We just talked about that. They have the right to see any non-confidential council materials at the same time the council receives them. So if you post your agenda packets to a website, you're fully compliant with that. They have the right to say anything during public comment, even if it's not related to agency business. This can be frustrating because it's not an ordinary thing, but under California law, public comment is public comment. They can say what they want to say. They have a brief time to say it, but they can say pretty much anything. And finally, members of the public have the right to be critical of the county. They have the right to be critical of any elected officials. They have a right to be critical of staff. They have a right to be critical of you as a council, as a body, even individuals. And they have a right to be critical of other members of the public. We sometimes get asked the question, can we cut someone off if they're being insulting or demeaning? The answer is generally no. You can obviously scold someone after the fact if they're being unkind, but generally speaking, I don't recommend turning off anybody's mic while they're speaking. And you can say afterwards, and I really do appreciate occasionally the chair will say something like, I find your comments extremely belittling and unproductive. You're allowed to say that. What you can't do is turn off the microphone because you don't want other people to hear it. So there are limited circumstances where the board is allowed to talk about in response to public comment for things that aren't on the agenda. This happens fairly often where a person will get up and say, I want you to put this on the agenda and I want to hear what you each think about this thing that I'm telling you about right now during public comment. Your response is, the Brown Act forbids us from talking about things that aren't on the agenda, even if you raise them from the podium, except to do the following 6 things. Either briefly respond to the statements or any questions, make a brief announcement or a report of your own activities. Sometimes there are council member reports about what events you went to or things that are coming up or whatever. You're allowed to ask questions of the speaker or of staff for clarification in response to public comment. You can refer a commenter to staff for more information. That's a very practical and pragmatic move to say, thank you for your comment. I would ask you to follow up with this member of our staff or this member of the council who's got a special interest in it. Take it offline. Request staff to report back on an item if it's appropriate to do so in response to a public comment, or direct staff to place the item on a future agenda. Notice not on the same agenda unless you can meet the standard for the item came to your attention after the posting of the agenda and you have a 2/3 vote. And again, I don't recommend doing that as a matter of course. So very briefly, I'll talk about closed sessions, not because they happen with the MCC. In fact, I don't think you've held a closed session maybe ever. Municipal advisory committees generally tend not to. But other agencies that are subject to the Brown Act can hold closed sessions under very narrow circumstances to discuss very particular topics. You can't have a closed session because it would be awkward to have the discussion in public. You can have a closed session if it's one of the specified items in the Brown Act that are entitled to be discussed in closed session. Then if any action is taken in closed session, there's a requirement that you report out the action verbally. Very briefly, there was an addition to the Brown Act in 2014. It's not a recent addition, but a lot of agencies haven't really made the adjustment fully yet. But the legislative body is required to report every vote of the council. And that means that when you hold a vote, and here on teleconference, all votes are done by roll call, even though it's a roll call vote, the chair is supposed to announce what the vote was. The vote was 5-2 in favor, with council members Olson and Erickson voting no. That's a report. It was 5-2 is not a report. It passes by majority is not a report. So if, in other words, you have to say who voted yes and who voted no. You don't have to list everybody individually, but I find a really elegant thing for unanimous votes is to say the vote is unanimous, because then you've reported who voted which way. The roll call will tell you who voted yes, everybody. And then if it's a split vote, you say 5 votes in favor, 2 votes against, and then specify which members of the council voted no, because then that's a record and it's compliant with this rule that the vote is announced because everybody who voted no gets a record of having voted no. So what are the consequences of Brown Act violations? Generally, the DA can bring a lawsuit. Any interested person can also bring a lawsuit. There are procedural requirements where they have to send you a letter that says you violated the Brown Act and I need you to fix it. If you get one of those letters, please contact our office. We will help you through the process. Generally, a civil lawsuit can stop a practice of an agency that repeatedly violates the Brown Act. If people aren't allowing public comment or something like that, a lawsuit could be brought to compel the agency to change its practices. There generally tends to be an allowance to cure the problem, to fix the problem, and that if you choose not to fix the problem, a court could declare your action void, which could be awkward if you took a significant action and now a court is telling you it didn't count. There are technically criminal violations for criminal sanctions for intentional violations, which are very serious, and sometimes these prosecutions do get brought. They generally require an element of intentionality, that somebody knowingly violated the Brown Act in a way that was designed to deprive the public of their rights. So it's not every violation of the Brown Act results in a criminal sanction. Some violations do, and they have to meet certain narrow categories. And if an outside person brings a lawsuit against the MCC for a Brown Act violation and wins, then the county is liable for attorney's fees. So we recommend that you have practices that comply with the Brown Act. So I promised those of you that were seasoned veterans that there would be something new, and this is something new. AB 992, sponsored by Assemblymember Mullen, clarified a thing that had been of some confusion for many years, which is, does posting on social media constitute a hub meeting? Okay, so you can imagine, I described what a hub meeting was. You can imagine that if a member of the MCC posts something on social media and all 7 members of the MCC see the post, that is being in the same place for purposes of the definition of a hub meeting, because you are hearing information about how a member of the MCC is feeling about a particular issue. It doesn't feel particularly wrong because social media feels public, but it's not. And not every social media platform allows everybody to see everyone else's posts. And not everybody is using every social media platform. So when you use something, when you tweet something, it feels like you're putting it out there for the universe, but you're really only putting it out there for other Twitter users. And you're only putting it out there for people who are on Twitter following you. And if it's all 7 members of the MCC that are following you, amongst many others, but lots of co-signers aren't on Twitter, then they're not seeing it. And it's not agendized and it's not compliant with the rules. So for a long time, we have had some doubt about whether using social media to communicate with the public also had the effect of having a non-public communication with other members of the same Brown Act body constituting a hub meeting. Well, Assemblymember Mullen fixed this problem for us by enacting a law that says that members of Brown Act bodies can post their thoughts and ideas on social media platforms that meet certain qualifications. Everybody generally understands that it includes Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Nextdoor, several others, but it requires that the platform be free to join and that you don't have the power to control who's allowed to join. So you can't create your own social media platform that includes all of your friends and then post your thoughts. It won't be subject to this rule of a public social media platform. And you're not allowed to block people from seeing your posts if you're going to rely upon this law. So if you're going to be public in a social media platform post, be public. Set the privacy settings to public, because that gives you the maximum protection from any accusation that a person might bring saying that you were secretly communicating with other members of the MCC, plus a whole bunch of other members of the public, but not everybody. So you are allowed to use social media to communicate with your constituents, to communicate with the public, stakeholders, freely now, if you are using one of the recognized social media platforms and not employing privacy settings or blocking to keep people from seeing your posts. However, AB 992 giveth and it taketh away. What it giveth is it finally clarifies that you can post on social media. What it taketh away is that you are now forbidden from interacting with each other on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. And that's a profound thing, so I'm going to repeat it so it's understood. You are now forbidden from interacting with each other on social media platforms on matters relating to MCC business. Now remember, I told you before that the rules only applied if it implicated a majority of you. So if 4 of you all click like on the same post on Facebook before AB 992, that could be a potential violation, but if only 2 of you did, it wouldn't be a violation. But AB 992 goes further. It says you can't interact with each other at all. So you may not repost each other's stuff, retweet each other's stuff, click like, click dislike, give a little heart emoji, give a little heart hug emoji, give a frowny face emoji, none of it. All forms of interaction on social media with other members of the MCC are now forbidden to you if the post is about matters of your jurisdiction. And that's new, and it will go into effect on January 1st. So please internalize that this new rule might change something that you've gotten very comfortable with in the past, and just be mindful of the fact that you have now an opportunity to communicate with your constituents freely, but there are 6 of your constituents that you're not allowed to interact with, and those are the fellow members of the MCC. Because you are, at the end of the day, all each other's constituents. But 6 of you are in a special category with regard to the 7th, with regard to you. So you have slightly fewer First Amendment rights with regard to lobbying your fellow members of the MCC than the average person on in the Midcoast, but you also have more power in the sense that your advice, your decisions carry more weight and are given more consequence. So it is sort of a bit of a balance, but that's what AB 992 says. And the final slide. Oh no, I'm sorry, two slides. I was asked the question, should I state, not may I, you know the answer that you may. Should I state my opinion publicly in an editorial or a social media post? You absolutely may, it's not illegal to do so. Telling the public what you think is the equivalent of telling them in person, and even engaging with members of the public and promising them your support or opposition to a particular initiative, a particular project or whatever, that's always been legal to do. You can always talk with your constituents. It's each other that you're not allowed to talk to or that there are special rules that apply to. However, the question was, should I state my opinion? So I'm not going to tell you that you can't because the law says that you can. But the longer you serve in a public role, the more you might realize that there are ways in which making a public commitment about your view of a matter in advance of any public discussion puts you in an awkward position. And you might choose not to be in an awkward position. So what I consider to be advanced boardsmanship is when you're talking with a member of the public, you can say, I hear what you're saying, and you may even say, and I agree with you. I hear what you're saying, but I really want to hear from my colleagues before I make any decision or commit my vote. Because the idea of the Brown Act is that that deliberation matters. Hearing what your fellow colleagues might say about the topic is supposed to matter to you. It may not, you can decide that it doesn't. But the point of the Brown Act is that you're supposed to have your deliberations in public. And if all 7 members of the MCC are going around telling members of the public how they're going to vote in advance, then the fix really is in, and it does undermine the quality of the discussion, because you may not feel you have the freedom to change your mind if you've told all of your constituents that you're going to vote no, or that you're going to vote yes. So generally speaking, while it may not be possible not to have an opinion, and you certainly don't need to not have an opinion, you may find that making a public commitment of your view before you've even had one meeting at which you've heard your colleagues, because remember, they can't talk to you offline like you can't talk to them. So they're not allowed to tell you what they think. They can't convince you yet. So you might want to give them at least one opportunity in a public meeting to convince you before you start saying how you feel about a thing. But your vote is your vote. And I'm not here to tell you that you can't say in advance how you plan to vote. It's just that I have found, advising public officials for many years, that in general saying, I agree with you as a general matter, but I have not decided how I'm going to vote until after I hear from my colleagues, is an extremely valuable tool that actually promotes the value of the public meeting and the public process. Because you have not heard from the public, you've only heard from the people that have called you. And you'll hear from the public when you get public comment at the meeting. So why are you committing your vote before you've heard from the other people at the public meeting? Maybe because you already know what you're going to do. But anyway, that's one answer to, should I state my opinion publicly? You absolutely may. You may decide that it's wiser not to. Okay, this really is the last slide, I promise. So the Brown Act rules in a nutshell are: 1, please hold your meetings in public. 2, please don't hold any meetings not in public. And we defined meetings broadly enough to include communications amongst a majority of you. So don't have any private meetings amongst a majority of members. And 3, by virtue of AB 992, don't engage with each other's posts on social media, even if it feels like you're being public when you do so. Because the law doesn't care that the post is public. It says that you may not interact with any other member on social media, may not engage with any other member. So you can be friends on Facebook, just don't interact with each other's posts. Okay, so that was it for my presentation. I hope I covered all the questions that at least I was aware of before I started, but you may have questions by virtue of what I've said.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. That was very thorough. And I can't promise that we don't have any follow-up questions, because I think at least I have a few, and I think other people might, but you answered a lot, so that was great. I'm thinking about what you said in terms of what to do next, and usually I think we would ask clarifying questions next, but I feel like that may veer into like discussion. So going to the public.
Sorry to interrupt. No. There is actually one question I want to go over, because I think about 4 slides back that we have been violating that unknowingly.
Yeah, I have several questions. I guess what I'm proposing is to go to public questions first, okay, and then to have our questions. But because I think we'll have detailed questions, or we can do all of ours and then we can save the public questions. We're not going to be deliberating anything in this situation, I guess. But
yeah, what your preference is fine, whichever you want to do.
Okay.
I'm trying to unshare my screen and having some difficulty finding the controls. Ah, there we go.
Dave can take care of that. Okay. Well, I will ask at this point if any members of the public would like to comment on this topic. Please raise your hand by going to participants and then using the blue raised hand button. If you have any questions or comments. Okay, Dolores Silva. Please go ahead. Dolores, I think you're still on mute. Nope.
Okay. Oh,
There you go.
am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a brief question, I think. The concern I have is like, if 3 members are allowed to confer, what if those same 3 members confer all the time? Is there any kind of, I mean, it can create like a hub within the MCC that kind of has control. Is that allowed?
Would the chair like me to answer?
So
I'm happy to do so.
okay, yeah, let's go ahead and have you answer that.
Sure. It actually is preferred that the same 3 members confer, because keeping track of who you've talked to about various topics is extremely complicated. And at least if you're being consistent, you're more likely to comply. The protection that the public has is that there never will be control, because by definition, it's always less than a majority. That's why the rule is written the way that it is. It will always be less than a majority that talk offline. They can never amass sufficient votes to carry forward board business in private meetings because they can't meet amongst a majority of them. The hub meeting problem comes about when you've got different portfolios of members that you're managing on various topics, and there's some spillover, like, you know, I find this person very knowledgeable about land use. I'm always going to talk to him. But then there's this other person that is really big on parks, and so I want to talk to that person. Like, in other words, you would need, your dance card would quickly get very complicated to keep track of who you've talked to make sure that both you have not talked to 3 people, you've only talked to 2, and that the people that you're talking to are doing the same thing. And that's really hard to manage. So one thing, I don't know that it works for the municipal advisory committees, but I'll just throw it out there in case it's of interest. Some school boards, when they have new members, will appoint a board buddy. Not appoint. Each newly elected school board member can choose to have a board buddy, because remember, on school boards, rule of 1, right? 5 members, you can only talk to 1 person. So to be really cautious and make sure that you internalize the Brown Act rules without violating them, a new member will pick 1 member of the board, maybe a seasoned school board member, and only talk to that person offline. That 1 person, and then the other people they'll talk to in public meetings.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions from members of the public? Okay, let's go on to questions from members of the council, and I'll start with our new members. And I guess we'll do the normal kind of 3 minutes of time, but we can go around again if we have additional questions. So why don't we start with Greg?
3 minutes isn't going to be enough. Let's say I have 10 questions. Can I email Tim Fox with my questions, and I may even have an opinion, and ask him those questions and copy the entire MCC in that email? Second part of the question is, if I only write to him directly and he replies, can I then distribute his answer to the MCC?
There is no general exception to the Brown Act for legal advice. So my preference would be that if you have questions, that we create a process for answering them. And then I'll talk with the chair about whether or not it makes sense to create a document that can be distributed to the other members. But really, it's not about what you have to say. What you have to say shouldn't be distributed to the other members, but what I have to say can be. So we just need to make sure that I'm not conveying information, an information payload from you to other members of the council. But it's perfectly appropriate for staff to communicate with all members and make sure they all have the same information. We just need to strip it of any information payload about what an individual council member is thinking.
Got it.
So I'm going to write you.
Sure.
Of course, we have no staff, which is an issue. If I uncover new news or research That's two different things. New news could be on something not currently on the agenda. Research could be on something that has been or will be agendized, like SFPUC plows the top off Montero Mountain. And the MCC isn't aware of it. Can I then take what I learned, in this case, it was a Montero Water and Sanitary District Board meeting, and send an email to the council and say, look, SFPUC just plowed the top off Montero Mountain? Is that finding of fact or research results allowed to be distributed, A, by email, or B, in some other way? I'm glad I'm not giving them easy ones.
The basic prohibition is upon using a technological device like email or an intermediary or other means to develop a collective concurrence as to an action to be taken. We have had a practice at times, different bodies have different sort of rules about how this works, of allowing FYIs so long as they're not editorialized to include, we need to do something about this, or I assume our next steps are obvious, or this is an outrage. But
Then how do you ask for something to be agendized so the outrage can be dealt with?
oh, well, asking for something to be agendized actually is probably the most celebrated exception to the Brown Act. The question is whether or not, why you're sending it to all members of the council as opposed to the chair. So
I guess to educate them on why it needs to be agendized. But are you telling me I only need to send it to the chair?
well, but you see the point of, well, I actually don't know what the practice is for the MCC about putting items on the agenda. I didn't research that before this call. But in general, if the point of the communication is to ask the person who has the power to set the agenda to agendize the item, then you're free to do that.
But I'm aware of other contexts where, let's say, the chair, and this is not Michelle, but is a blood clot in the artery of progress, and the chair does not want an item agendized. I'm aware that there's a procedure for more than one member of a council body overriding the chair's restriction and demanding something be agendized. So if I don't send it to all the members, how do I get by the blood clot?
What I would recommend is that you use your board report function, brief report of your own activities, or during the public meeting saying, I'm asking that this be agendized at our next meeting. Because then you're allowed, remember, anything that happens in the public meeting is by definition public. So saying, I want this agendized, and then, obviously a lot of this comes down to the functioning of the council as a group, but anything can be agendized if there's majority support for agendizing it. So even if there were a chair that was acting as a traffic cop for what goes on any particular agenda, the agenda can, you can say, I would ask that we agendize this for a future meeting and then see what happens. The answer is no.
You'll get an email from me.
Section of
You'll get an email.
Okay, I want to be clear. I'm counsel to the MCC, not to individual members of the MCC. So I will answer legal questions, but I can't really advise you about how to proceed. I don't think that distinction will matter in this case, but I just wanted to be clear.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll definitely come back to you, Greg, because it sounds like you have more questions, but let's go around the council. So Jill, do you have any questions for Tim Fox? You're on mute, Jill, if you're talking. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so let's move on. Dave?
She put something in chat.
Oh, she did? Oh, okay. Jill, you might want to try calling in, and then we'll come back to you after Dave.
She's dialed in on her phone as well as in the browser.
Do you know the code to unmute on the phone?
Yeah, it's *6.
Try that, Jill.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, I do not have any questions. I'm curious to hear Greg's other questions. I don't know if I can give him my time.
Oh, we'll have plenty of time, I think, as long as Tim has time. We'll go back around as needed.
Thanks.
But thanks. Okay, Dave, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, this was on the split vote issue. To the best of my knowledge, the MCC has very rarely recorded who's on the low side on the split votes in our minutes, or stated them during the meeting. We do have videos of all of our meetings, so at least the public can find out. But I want to make sure I understood you correctly, that both during the meeting on a split vote and in the minutes, we should be recording who voted on the smaller side. Is that correct?
Yes, if you want to record both sides of the vote, the ayes were as follows, the nays were as follows, that's compliant too. I'm just providing, verbally, this is the minimum number of words you can say that still complies. The vote was unanimous. The vote was 4-2 with the following, persons voting no. You've communicated the thing that you need to communicate, which is how the members present voted.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have anything else, Dave?
It's worth clarifying on the hub that a hub through a public member where the public member is not in violation, but if 3 of us talk to a public member and then say, hey, why don't you go talk to Greg? That's a violation. Or even if we don't say that and he does, Greg should ask who else they talked to.
A minor quibble, I don't think it would be a problem to say you should go talk to Greg, but you should definitely not say, and here's what you should say to him. So you can't use members of the public as messengers amongst and between yourselves.
Okay. Let's keep going around. So Len, do you have any questions? And I'll go to Claire after this. Len, you're on mute, it looks like.
I'm here. Two questions that relate, I guess, in some way to opposing views. If you were, especially this might relate to the board having a study session on something, either in a regular meeting or special, but if there were 2 sides of the issue, as it were, and you had 2 pairs of council members, one taking one side and one the other, but not interacting with each other, does that present a problem?
Ultimately, no, because it does come down to a vote, and the vote is whatever it is. I think a lot of agencies have found it productive when it does break down on those kind of polarities. One person feels strongly one way, another feels strongly the other way. Sometimes appointing those 2 members to an ad hoc advisory subcommittee, even though they don't have an agreement in the meeting, sometimes that productively produces a compromise solution.
This relates to a little bit of a different situation that I'm thinking of, and that is, as we pointed out, and we have no staff. So sometimes you have issues that really just require research, investigation, but in an investigation, you might approach it from 2 different sides. So having 2 teams looking at it from different directions is you're benefiting from the interaction just to do the exploration. So in that sense, it's not driving to the final vote part, but just bringing the information forward.
That's fascinating. I've never thought of it that way, but if you created the ad hoc advisory subcommittee for yes and the ad hoc advisory subcommittee for no, and then had them working separately from each other and then bringing their respective recommendations back to a future meeting, I don't see that violating the Brown Act, because the prohibition is on them meeting with each other amongst themselves, right?
Okay.
So if it's less than a majority, having opposing sides pitted against each other, I think is perfectly legal.
Yeah. Then
it may make for an extremely awkward meeting when the 2 of them present, but other than that, there's nothing illegal under the Brown Act.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Then related to that, in social media, you basically said if a member posts, you can't make, whether it's small comments like chuckle, chuckle, or smiley, but suppose 2 members each put in major posts. They were just representing different views, but not interacting with each other directly. Any problem with that?
No, that's actually the thing that was legalized. So yeah, the idea is that you can use social media to talk to the public generally, but that you should not directly engage, that's the language from the statute, with each other.
So
And
maybe
directly
the-
engage includes things that have now become second nature on social media, like retweeting, whether to agree or disagree, or clicking an emoji.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, Lynn?
That's it for now.
Okay, let's go to Claire and then Dan after that.
Great presentation. I wrote down a lot of things to ask you, and then for the most part, the next sentence you answered them. So that's good. I had a few though I wanted to follow up with. I'll just start with one, and then when we go around, I'll do another. We talked about the process, which we very frequently do, of having a group of two or three people writing a letter to be presented to the council. And from what I'm understanding, you said we can't sort of jointly help each other write it unless we show all of our work to the public, like what words we changed and stuff like that. Is that correct?
Well, unfortunately, this is a law that was written in the early 60s, and they had no way of seeing something like a Google Doc coming. So the law is not really modern about transparency by other means. So even if you had an edit trail that you then daylighted to the public and said, this is what each member of the committee added and how each of them wordsmithed it, that's still not legally compliant. So my recommendation for group writing projects is that you have one or two people draft, because they can talk freely with each other without violating the Brown Act, and then bring the draft for approval to a public meeting, because that is compliant. But having every member weigh in is, I don't see any way to reconcile that with the Brown Act.
Every member of what? Like if there's a group of two or three people working on this document, it's okay to have those people do that?
That would be right.
That's still okay.
Either as an ad hoc subcommittee actually appointed by formal action of the MCC, or as an organic gathering of less than a majority, to which the Brown Act never applied anyway. So if three people wanted to get together to draft a document together and then bring it to an MCC meeting for approval, that'd be fine. It's sharing it in advance that's the problem. You can share it as part of the board packet, but sharing it for feedback, sharing it for input, there's really no effective way to do that consistent with the Brown Act.
I don't think we do that. It sounds like what we're doing is acceptable.
Sure.
We do post whatever we've come up with the agenda, so that people see it ahead of time, but there's no input.
And if that's the first time the other members of the MCC are seeing the document too, then
Yeah.
it's fully compliant.
Okay. I'll save my other questions for next round.
Okay, thank you. That was one of the questions I had too. Dan, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Tim, for a very thorough presentation. I listened to it all. No questions now. I'll give my time to Greg.
Okay, we'll go back to Greg. I do have some questions I want to get answered, and Greg will be next after this. So I'm going to do rapid fire. Hopefully these will be simple. With the agenda packet, the timing of that, does that need to be posted 72 hours in advance?
No, there's no law that requires that the agenda packet be posted at the same time as the agenda. There is a law that requires that when the members get it, the public gets it too.
Okay.
So you can post the agenda on a Wednesday, finish the board packet on a Friday for a, well, now I've screwed up by setting a weekend meeting. You can post the agenda packet after the agenda's been posted. What you're not allowed to do is give it to the members first and the public later. Has to be simultaneous.
Okay. We've had issues where things get sent out, things for consideration, let's say 24 hours in advance or even less. So people feel like they don't have adequate time to review. There's nothing against the Brown Act that would violate, but that's just a bad practice probably, right?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's unavoidable. People are working on documents right up to the last minute. Sometimes there are edits to the document in the meeting. So that's all perfectly natural if it's necessary. The only prohibition is on having members of the committee, giving them more, having members of the council get more time to think about it than members of the public.
For sure. Okay. And then giving public comment or public comment during meetings, I know we can limit time. Is there a specific number of minutes? I think normally we do like 3 minutes, but is there a specific thing that qualifies as like you need to give people at least a certain amount of time?
That's a great question, and I've actually litigated that issue in the Superior Court of San Mateo County. So at least I have a data point. The answer is no. There is no general law that says that this is too little time or this is an adequate time. We do know that 2 minutes is a standard for a lot of agencies. There's safety in numbers, but it all is supposed to be kind of flexible and tied to the appropriate amount of comment and deliberation. So if you see a line of people out the door, all of whom are going to be giving public comment on the item, you can adjust the amount of time each speaker gets to account for that. If you would ordinarily do 3 minutes, but there are a number of speakers, nothing illegal about saying, let's make it 2.
Okay.
There's also nothing illegal about saying we're going to cap all public comment at an hour. That is a rather drastic result because it means that some people don't get to speak at all. So it isn't something that we recommend being taken lightly. And definitely if you're doing that, you can't do a thing where you sort the speaker cards and have everybody in favor of the item talk first and everybody opposed to it talk second. So, but I can't imagine that that would be, something that would come up. So 2 minutes, you're relatively safe doing 2 minutes. There is a little bit of information that we have about land use matters, where if you're holding the developer to 2 minutes or the homeowner with the project to 2 minutes, and then project opponents pool their time and speak, against the item, at a certain point that does become a little lopsided because generally speaking, the sheer number of speakers in opposition to a land use matter tend to be greater than the proponents of it. So, we say, if the presentation is about the project and describing the project, maybe the time limits don't apply to that, but people giving their comments on the project, maybe it does.
Okay, thank you.
You have to just kind of, be a little, I wouldn't say strategic, just cognizant of the dynamics.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, well, my 3 minutes is up, so we'll move to Greg, Dr. Greg, thank you.
Since I'm the new person here, I don't want to dominate it. I will ask a follow-up to the question that you raised because it's been on my mind, Michelle. It's about enforcing a minute limit. We have people who have been known to ramble, and it's, I think, harmed the meetings materially in some cases because we go way too late. And the last items on the agenda cannot even be considered fully. So the question is it all right to enforce that speaking limit, A, on the public, and B, on the board members?
Okay, I'll answer the easy part first. The speaker limits are about equity so that everybody is operating from the same set of rules. So it is perfectly appropriate when a speaker is going over time to use an escalating set of interventions. I recommend starting with a verbal warning, please wrap up at 10 or 20 seconds over, at 30 seconds over saying, I'm sorry, you've run out of time, you're going to need to stop. At a certain point, you start gaveling and turning microphones off. It's legal to do that. It is legal to enforce every person who's participating in the meeting has a right to an orderly meeting. And so it's legal to enforce speaker times, even if it means turning off microphones at the conclusion of, what I don't recommend is shutting off the microphone at the 2 minute mark. That gets people riled up in unfortunate ways. But like an escalating set of interventions of, thank you for your comment, please wrap up. The Board of Supervisors gets this all the time. So you could actually see how that's done there. With regard to time limits on members, that really is kind of, again, a matter of equity. It's a different kind of equity amongst the members. And it really is, it's kind of that you vote for a chair, the chair presides at the meetings. everybody kind of develops an expectation about how they'll be treated and how others will be treated. Most of the time, you're trying to look like you're being reasonable so that people will vote with you. So most of the time, you don't have to have enforced speaker limits on members because people self-police a little bit. But if that's not working out well and more people are taking more time, and here I am rambling on with my answer, then, you know, so long as it's fairly applied, it's not illegal to do. It all arises from the exact same language in the statute, which says that reasonable regulations of time, place, and manner of speakers is allowed. And that includes both the public and members of the council.
So when the air molecules stop vibrating from this session, how can we produce a document that is endorsed by you that represents the MCC's practices and understandings with regard to some of the issues we're raising tonight?
You could do so. You could draft something that you would like the council to take action on, and I'm happy to consult on whether I think it's legally compliant. Chances are most anything you come up with procedurally is probably within your rights if a majority of the council wants it to be so. There's a lot of flexibility about how every California public agency runs its meetings. City councils are different from each other. The Board of Supervisors is different from that. School boards are different. So you can propose something. I don't think it would be wise for me to try to put pen to paper and write something for you, though, because you're more familiar with your meetings than I am. Happy to, you know, consult and weigh in when it's proposed for action. But again, there is no best practices for how to run a meeting for a local agency in California. They're all very different.
Excuse me, may I interject with a point of information?
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
So Tim, the MCC has bylaws that clearly state that there should be allowed free and open discussion, I believe. And could you please confirm that our bylaws supersede?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So our bylaws clearly state that there should be free and open discussion. Free and full open discussion. So when you put time limits and intentionally cutting someone off at now 2 minutes is being suggested, which I'm very much against. You know, this is a problem because it's essentially squelching.
Every parliamentary body is operated essentially at the consent of its members. There are exceptions. There is, for example, a resolution of the Board of Supervisors that establishes the MCC and provides for some basic rules of conduct of not really of how the meetings proceed, but related matters. And so we would look first to your founding documents with the Board of Supervisors for the answers to these questions. And then the bylaws are a matter of action for you. So if someone proposes changing the bylaws, they are free to make a motion to do so. And then it will be put to a vote. There will essentially be a check about whether or not what's proposed is in excess of the MCC's authority. But yeah, it's how your meetings go are largely at the consent of the membership and the election of the chair.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Greg. Do you still have more, Greg? Let's go around.
I think I'll write an email to Tim. And yeah, there is a lot more going on.
Well, we can. I just want to keep kind of going around. So just quick, it sounds like Jill didn't have anything, but definitely speak up if you have anything you've thought of since the last round. Dave, did you have anything else right now?
Nothing else from me.
Claire?
I'm going to skip some of what I had written down. I do think if you look at the minutes, we usually do identify people that have voted no. We often don't have people voting no on things, so it may not be obvious, but we should make an effort to do that if we're not. I was going to say something about the concept of people giving their time to somebody else, whether in the public or between board members, but that doesn't seem right to me, but I guess we'll deal with all of that when we deal with what kind of time limits we have on our speaking. I do think we need to deal with that whole topic.
Okay. Any other questions for Tim?
No, I don't think so.
Dan? Anything else right now?
Yes. So, Tim, at what point is a public meeting not public when it's over controlled and the people that come there are not allowed to, really, give their full thoughts?
I guess my answer to that question would be if someone can point me to a section of the law that's violated by how the meeting is conducted, that would be the point. But things that are a matter of parliamentary procedure generally don't rise to the level of law. They generally tend to be, again, a matter of cooperation amongst the members more than having the force of law. So there's no one answer to that question. If there's a concern that the public has a right under the Brown Act that's not being secured by the conduct of the meetings, then we would make suggestions for how to change the conduct of the meetings to ensure that that happens.
That's another thing that's in our bylaws, is clearly stated, Robert's Rules of Order shall not apply. So I think given that it's written clearly to have a full and free discussion, Robert's Rules of Order shall not apply. The intention of the founders were to have a open, a free, informal discussion with some level of order, of course, and some reasonable amount of time limitation of speaking.
Do you want to comment on that, Tim?
It's a political question. How much time? I mean, there are agenda items that are worthy of much more discussion and others that are worthy of less. And it's up to the body to decide how it wants to run itself.
Yeah, and it sounds like we do need to have a discussion on that. We are already over time for the meeting, and for the and we do have the Rosenberg Rules of Order presentation from Dave after this. I do have one other question. One or actually two. Hopefully they'll be quick, that I would like clarification on. And so the first one is on the social media question, since that's new, and there are a lot of intricacies to that. So I'm very clear that a member of the council cannot post something on social. Well, a member can, but that someone else cannot comment, like, engage at all with something that another council member posts. However, let's use the example of like next door. Let's say a member of the public posts something, and then a council member responds to that member of the public, and then another council member responds on the same topic in the same thread to that member of the public. Can that happen as long as the two are not directly engaging with each other?
Yeah, the law says directly engage, and it's been the law for like 5 minutes now.
Yeah.
So we don't have any court cases that interpret it. We don't have a lot of regulatory guidance. We're often in this space where, we're the ones that administer the laws that nobody else pays attention to. So we don't know. I have my gut feeling, which is that two public officials commenting on the same private member of the public's post is not directly engaging within the meaning of that rule unless they like tag each other or call each other out by name. I think that would be direct engagement within the meaning of the rule.
Okay.
But I don't think it's not a race to the post, right? Like it shouldn't be first person to comment gets to say their piece and then everybody else has to shut up. I don't think that's the rule.
Okay. Very helpful there. Okay. I think that's it for me. I think, Greg, did you have anything else? Or are you going to save the rest to?
Thank you, David. No indication.
No.
Okay. Okay. I think that we've gone around to everyone.
There's one more hand up from Dolores.
Okay. So we've already had the chance for public comment, and now this is.
I just wanted you to know.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Dolores. Please reach out to me directly.
I'm sorry, I got to object because, all of this information that the council discussed, now the community may have a question. I think we jumped it out of order from the start. So I really would plead that, urge you to allow the community to speak. There's only one person, come on.
Well, we're about to have a presentation on Rosenberg's Rules of Order, which I have things to learn from too. I will have Dolores speak, but we don't need, that doesn't necessarily mean Tim is going to respond. So, okay, Dolores, if you have something to say, I don't see your hand up anymore, but if you do have something to say, feel free to speak right now.
Yes, I just wondered how the Brown Act applies to public meetings like we had with Connect the Coast Side, in which we couldn't see or hear what all the public said. And, there were breakout sessions. Or sometimes the meetings are held as webinars where you can't see other participants or really have a feel for what's going on. Are there rules that apply to virtual meetings that stem out of the Brown Act and trying to assure public participation that is thorough?
So
A board or a commission.
I think, yeah, we're not going to talk about other groups on this call, but I think if your question is specific to, is there something about a virtual meeting? Are there any rules specific to a virtual meeting that change the Brown Act? That's something that we haven't really heard from you, Tim, on. So if you could talk to anything to that, to answer that question about virtual meetings specifically.
Sure. There have been provisions in the Brown Act for what were called teleconferences for many, many years, and they were extremely limited. The rules for conducting a teleconference were so onerous that many times people who wanted to participate by teleconference wound up deciding it wasn't worth their time, and they wound up being absent from the meeting instead of actually complying with the rules as they then were written. The governor's executive order at the beginning of the pandemic loosened some of the restrictions about holding meetings by teleconference because otherwise no meetings could be conducted at all. I expect that those rules will probably continue indefinitely. They are in effect tonight and you are complying with them now. Other of the rules have not been suspended. So for example, the rule that if anybody is on teleconference, all votes have to be by roll call and can't be done by voice vote is in effect and has been in effect since March for every public agency holding a public meeting. Whether there are generally applicable rules about how much you can see and what happens when there are audio dropouts and all of that, None of that is actually governed by the law yet. Maybe it will be someday, but you know, I've heard people say things like, I can't effectively participate because I can't see the plans on the screen because they're too small, because all I have is my phone and I'm being denied the right of participation. The law has not addressed any of that yet. And I don't know that it ever really will. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we can have meetings in person again before long, and many of these issues will become secondary. But yeah, the law does not come down to the specifics of who can see what and who can at any given time. There is a rule, I believe, still in effect that says that when you do a teleconference, you can't effectively have, it's complicated, but the rule was that every teleconference location needed to hear every other teleconference location. That was when it was understood that you would have like two, the Board of Supervisors of Kern County could meet 150 miles apart, 3 members in one place, 2 members in another, something like that. But that you needed to hear in both rooms. You couldn't have one room that was listen only. How that rule applies in Zoom, I'm not sure. You know, how it applies in other online platforms, I'm not sure. We rely upon muting all the time to conduct meaningful discussions, because without it, who knows how these things would go. But in general, when a person is called upon, they need to be able to be heard. And that's it, when they're called upon to speak. Giving them the option to interrupt the meeting by unmuting themselves is not a rule, for example. I don't think that's a requirement. But anyway, we're all just trying to get along with implementing the intent of the Brown Act under circumstances that were never contemplated by Ralph M. Brown or his contemporaries.
Right. Yeah, thank you. It'll be really interesting to see which parts of this are able to continue after the pandemic is over. Okay, with that, I'm going to close this agenda item, and so much thanks to Tim. This has been very, very insightful. I'm sure that individuals will have follow-up questions either to you directly or send, I know I may have some follow-up questions. Yeah, thank you so much for taking your time. Sorry we went over, but I really appreciate it.
I understand.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on to item 2B, which is Rosenberg's Rules of Order. I'm going to hand this over to Dave, who's prepared a quick presentation on this.
Yeah. Both this one pager and the entire, all of 5 pages, Rosenberg's Rules of Orders are posted on the website. I do not intend to read this. I'm going to hit some highlights and then answer questions. And hopefully, since we're significantly over, this will be short, but we'll see. So Rosenberg's Rules of Orders were written to basically have a simpler set of rules for running meetings in small bodies that were easier to understand. Historically, a lot of organizations have used Robert's Rules of Orders, which are based on the way Congress was run at one point. They're moderately complicated. It'd be pretty hard to boil them down to one page like this. So anyway, so the intent is simpler, smaller bodies, less formal. And I'll say, as we've seen tonight, that the MCC tends to be even less formal than Rosenberg's rules, but when it comes to motions, we do need to follow that. And in particular, even when we're being informal, we need to be very careful, as was discussed during the Brown Act session, that we do not cut off the public's rights. One of Mr. Rosenberg's goals was to protect the minority voices while following majority rule, to have the chair make the final decision on interpreting the rules, which means that typically the chair takes a less intrusive role because they have more power, and it avoids having them overpower the organization. Chair decisions can be appealed. And then it basically follows the same process as motions. You need a second and you need a vote. And that becomes an immediate thing. That's not a, we can do this later. It has to be immediate. To the best of my knowledge, that has never been invoked at the MCC, but I haven't been at every single meeting. And as I said at the beginning, this one pager really does have everything you need to know on it. One important thing that I'm going to emphasize, because we have not been real good about following this for a lot of reasons, and it doesn't really matter what the reasons are, but I personally hope we can do a better job of following this, is that when we do the first round of council clarifications, they really should be clarifications. They should not be stating opinions. They should not be attempts to persuade other council members. They really should be just clarifications. I didn't understand this, or I think you forgot that. Those count as clarifications. And we can be fairly general on what's a clarification, but it should not be the time for the opinions and the persuasion. That's on the second council round. One huge difference between Rosenberg and Roberts, and we continue to have problems with this because we do these rarely, is when we have amendments to motions, the amendments get voted on before the actual original motion, which makes sense because if the amendment passes, then you're voting on an amended motion. So that has been confusing in the past. There is a possibility of doing a substitution motion. Again, that's something that, to the best of my knowledge, the MCC has never actually done. But if you do have a substitute motion and there's a second, then it gets voted on before the original motion or the motion with amendments. And if the substitution motion passes, then the original motion is not voted on. That's been pretty rare. In my experience at the MCC, what we've usually done is it's clear that we're not going to pass the original motion, and the original person making the motion usually withdraws the motion. So we don't need a substitute. But the mechanism exists. Another thing that we seldom do, but some of the other bodies on the coast do more often, is the motion to limit debate. I move the question. So this is somebody thinks we've talked about it too long, we've drifted off topic, whatever. If that actual motion is made and seconded, then debate is stopped and we proceed to a vote. This may address some of the concerns Dan keeps raising about free and open discussion. It's my opinion that we have, I know certainly I have, I think others have at times, gone on repetitively. And it may be that rather than having these arguments about whether sufficient discussion is had, it's time to start using this motion to limit debate. Then it's not just seen as something that the chair is doing. So that's really all I wanted to say about Rosenberg's Rules of Orders, and the rest of it will just be answering questions. So, okay. Michelle, I'll let you drive that.
Yeah, I'm going to go through the process here that's detailed out under life of a motion, even though technically this is not a motion. So we've already talked about the issue. We've introduced the item. Let's go to technical questions. I think you're right. We've had trouble keeping these technical. So let's go around and keep this to technical questions about what you presented. And we'll do the same order as last time. So technical questions about what you presented about Rosenberg's Rules of Order. Let's start with Greg.
No question.
Okay, Jill, do you have anything? Star 9. Yeah. Unmute. You can go ahead and type in the chat too. if you don't have anything or if you have a question.
Hi, Michelle.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like a copy of this. Is this on the MCC website?
It is. It's on the agenda item for tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Let's see. Dave, you probably don't have questions for yourself. Next was Len,
No questions?
Claire.
I'm going to ask a question just to illustrate, is this a technical
Uh.
appropriate question? Dave, you went through this motion to limit debate, which I have tried to use before and hasn't gone anywhere. It says it takes 2/3 majority to pass. So if I were to say I move the question, then Michelle would say, is there a second? And then we would have a vote on it. Is that how it should work?
Yes, and it would be, assuming everybody's present, it would be a vote of 5.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Let's see. Dan, any technical questions?
No questions.
Okay. I do have a question. It's on the motion to adjourn. Typically, I think we're all in a hurry to get out and we move to adjourn and then second, and then that's it. We don't have a vote. It seems like from reading this, we do need to have a vote. And I would think during the time of video conferencing, it needs to be a roll call vote. Is that your understanding as well?
Technically, it should be a vote. Most of us organizations are not real good about that, but some are very good about making sure that there's a vote. I don't think it needs to be a roll call vote, but that is up to you as chair at this point.
Well, it was per what Tim said that every vote during teleconference needs to be a roll call vote.
I guess if you want to go strictly by that, then this would have to be a roll call vote.
Okay. All right, that was my question. Now let's go to members of the public with any comments. If anyone has a question or comment, please raise your hand. Okay, I do not see anything. So then let's go back to the council. Does anyone have any comments? Not clarifying questions, but any comments? If you do, just please go ahead and speak.
Yeah, I want to say quickly that, I think the motion to adjourn, I don't think is, it's just going to add time to our meetings, and it's just going to, I don't think it's that important. We've never had a formal vote, never.
Okay, thanks for that. Anyone else? Okay, seeing as there's no other comments, let's close this agenda item and move on to item 3, which is future agendas. So item 3, future agendas. So we have obviously the meeting, the second meeting in December will be canceled because of the holidays. So we'll move. Our next meeting will be on January 13th, and then the second meeting of January will be on the 27th. Still have a retreat to be planned, and I plan on sending you guys an email with a doodle poll about that to try to figure out a date for that sometime in ideally January, the dates that we discussed. And I'm going to get Supervisor Horsley's additional options as well. So I know there are a couple other things that people have talked about adding to future agendas. I'll just ask right now, is there anything else that people want to suggest for a future agenda item?
I have 2 things to bring up for the meeting on the 13th.
Okay.
One of them relates to an email that came to me just before the meeting started, and I sent to the council. The neg deck for the Medio Bridge Replacement Project has gone out. I forwarded it to the council. Its comments are due by the 15th of January, which is obviously a very aggressive schedule for us. I think in this case, I just raised 2 points. One is, Michelle, it'd fall to you to pull together a team that might want to work on that. And two, you might reach out to the county and point out that coming in the midst of the holiday vacation, we appreciate a delay that would move the deadline out past our second meeting in January.
Okay, thank you for that. Hadn't seen your email. Yeah,
Post that on the front page of the website, by the way.
you will, you said?
I already did.
You already did. Okay, great. Yeah, that's an aggressive schedule for sure. And I do think we need to have, I definitely, we need to have that Medio Bridge on our meeting for the first meeting in January. So I will go ahead and add that. I know some other members have expressed interest in,
I had actually two items there that,
well, let me just, or are they both about Medio Bridge or?
correct, correct.
Okay, go ahead with your next one.
So separate from comments on the neg deck, I had interest in putting more emphasis into research on the questions that have been raised by the council and the public in our last meeting to bring further information forward. I've also reached out to Greg Diegas to work with me on that. And so that's an effort I'd like to undertake. I think in what we've discussed here that that would make that an ad hoc committee by bringing it up here. And if I understood the discussion with Tim.
It's only ad hoc if we form it as a vote of the council.
Right. So without the vote of the council, I could proceed and then also involve members of the public, right? That was the distinction.
You can't invoke, if you want to involve members of the public as a committee, then it needs to be a formal committee.
No, I understand. But if you don't do it that way and then proceed, then I'm just advising the council and take that up to bring it forward.
The way I understood that, and we can definitely clarify with Tim, was that a member or members of the council as an ad hoc subcommittee they can talk to individuals, but you can't talk to groups of people from the public, is how I understood that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Anyway, raise the point.
Talk to the group of, to me, that meant that you can't talk to the group of people who've already assembled as part of the Miramar community and work directly with them on this issue, right?
That's right.
Understand.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so it sounds like in preparation for what you would like to bring forward on January 13th, you're going to be working with Greg and you need a third person. Is that?
A third would be good. My point there is, though, this is not working on the neg deck, so they're two separate processes.
Yeah, and that's also tricky, right? Because they're different, but it's not like a yes and a no. There is probably some overlap.
That's partly why I raised the point that you can have two separate efforts going on.
Okay, Claire.
A suggestion that perhaps you could blend this into one item addressing everything you want to say in the terms of the neg deck. In other words, you can put your expert opinions or expert information into comments on the neg deck and we could just keep it simple. Is that possible?
That would make sense to me too.
I'm not sure that it is. But I really haven't had it just came literally minutes before the meeting started. So, I'm afraid I can't bring it to a conclusion. That's why I say it's sort of leave it with a chair to sort it out further.
Okay. Let me just call for is anyone else on the council other than Lynn or Greg interested in working on any aspects of this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Dave, anyone else? Okay. So it's possible that the three of you could work on that. I do think it would make sense to try to get that neg deck comment period delayed because
that'd fall to you to write a letter to the person who sent it to us.
I will.
Okay, that's all I had.
Okay. It's okay. We'll figure that out offline. Obviously, keeping it according to all the rules of the Brown Act. But it sounds like we have interest in working on at least part of this from the three of you. So we'll definitely have an agenda item on the January 13th agenda regarding Medio Bridge. And possibly again on the 27th if we're able to get that night deck delayed. Okay, anything else that anyone wants to bring to a future agenda? You can also email me individually.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, Dan?
So, there's currently an issue with the the new El Granada fire station lighting. There's been many complaints from the community that, some have said it lights up like a football field in front of their home. It blocks the ability for the community to see beyond, the moon sets, the ocean. It doesn't it doesn't match the existing street lighting color in the community. And when the community when the county proposed to change the lighting from I guess it was high pressure sodium to LED, the community took great pains to see that the color of the lighting and the brightness of the lighting stayed the same.
Yeah, Dan, not to cut you off, but you shared all that information last time. And so do you want to bring that as a future agenda item?
Yes.
You take the lead on that? Do you want to call for help from someone, if anyone else on the council would like to work with you on that? Or you
Sure.
people.
Any volunteers?
And we'll say that a code violation has been opened by Steve Terry on that.
Yeah, I'll work with
maybe
Dan.
maybe the timing of the maybe we should let the code violation. I'm not sure yet. I just wanted to say that I would like to see the agenda item be allowed and just know that it should be on the radar. As far as the exact timing, I could work with you offline, Michelle.
Okay, well, it sounds like Jill's interested in working with you on that. So why don't you two connect and decide what you think the best course of action and timing would be, and then just reach out to me. I'm happy to have that on a future agenda.
Okay, great.
Great.
Joe, you can contact me. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. So like I said, the retreat, we'll figure out a time and date for that. Okay, so do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
We adjourn.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. I think we should go through a roll call vote just to be.
Go for it, Claire.
Right.
Oh, go for it, Len. You're secretary now.
Oh, that's right, I am. Okay,
You can just take any objections.
here we go. Oh, no, we'll do it. Claire, your vote?
Yes.
Dave?
Yes.
Jill?
Yes.
Take that as a yes. Greg?
Yes.
Dan?
Yes, and good night.
Michelle?
Yes,
And myself, yes. Passes 7-0.
unanimous. All right. Great. Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody.
Happy holidays.
Good meeting. Take care. Bye-bye.
Today's